Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Thank you for joining me. Here is the second lecture for this week. I'm going to take you into one of the examples of how the Enlightenment and the thinkers of the period influenced actual behaviors and changes. And we're going to look at that with the American Revolution. Now, just to give you guys a little bit of a preview. There's actually quite a few slides on here. The last one was like 7 or 8. This one I think is like 21. Not going to go through all 21. I am going to go through it quickly, but when you need it for the critical analysis paper, you can go back and look at some of the slides as the examples of how people began to actually manifest those behaviors that were often theorized by the Enlightenment thinkers. Okay. So just go ahead and take a look at that, but I'm going to cover some of the examples. All right. So most of you, have some sort of familiar knowledge. If you grew up here in the States, no doubt was this the American Revolution covered to varying degrees. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to be focusing on the events that led up to the American Revolution and how those events are actually inspired by the events that were going on in Europe, the Enlightenment thinkers, which influenced many of the founding documents that have created our republic, namely the Declaration of Independence, and just to really try to understand how exactly our nation came to be, because I actually think that there's a lot to be said in terms of the development of how this nation actually arrives, right, and becomes this, republic. So it's important for us to understand that this is, much like everything else, it builds off of subsequent events. It's influenced by various ideas and thinkers and various experiences. And so we'll just take a look at that. Okay. So to be clear, while, after Luther in Europe, and while Europe is going through its tumultuous periods, whether that is the English Civil War or, the various effects of the Reformation or the other problems that were going on between various, monarchies and empires, right? The United States, which is not called that, it's just colonial territory, claimed by several different areas, but mostly at this time by Great Britain. It was under a period what is known as salutary neglect. Now, basically, this is a period of about 150 years or so, give or take, when you want to start your watch on it. But essentially, what it did was it was a period where you had a hands-off approach from England. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Well, the colonies certainly had forms of government. They had a system of laws. They had the guidance and the idea of protection from England. The problem is that England and all of its enforcement is over 3,000 miles away. It's separated by an ocean. So being able to get communication to to and from could take weeks, months, right? It wasn't as if this is something that could be done quickly. It's not as if communication is, easily traveling. And even if something was sent, it may not even get there. The ship may sink, could get captured, pirates, whatever the case may be. So the point is that although there was a foundation, there was a system of laws, there were some ideas to which the colonists had guidance. They had to essentially figure this out on their own. And what this means is that they had to implement the laws. They had to make adjustments. They had to figure out their own protection. They had to go through various processes to be able to survive. And it's during this process, this period of 150 years, that they start to come into their own, that they are influenced by ideas and issues that are going on in Europe. They're influenced by the events that are going on in their sphere of influence. And all of this culminates in eventually in 1763 with this notion that the colonies are no longer an extension of England, but have actually become something different, right? Something independent, something that is distinct. And so this is where we really just want to be able to understand like how exactly that sense of individuality, that difference, that sense of independence develops as a consequence of salutary neglect. So, as I mentioned, we have this little contact, and the main reason is because of the enormous geographic, range, between the two regions. But it's also, the fact that there's also limited resources and the lack of infrastructure. The king in England doesn't have the resources to be able to man and station the colonies, right? There isn't a standing army on this continent. Protection, the militia, the guidance, the laws, all of that is done locally. And so, the to be able to, establish what you would consider like a prefect or a governor, somebody that is, ruling in the king's name, right? This is very expensive. And so governance is left to the locals, right? Figure it out on your own. As long as, you don't, do too much, you'll be okay. But it's within that space, that flexibility, and largely being left to your own devices, where there's both, astonishing achievements and there's also some real, low points in American history. And so, of course, you have the early forms of governance, especially when you see how the royal colonies are established, the influences, what countries, the people that are in these areas. But you want to actually see like how exactly those administrations were established, basically between the early 1600s all the way to the mid 1700s. And so these early forms of governments were essentially what you would call like corporations, entrepreneurs, that they had to come up with their own ideas on how exactly they were going to function. They had to come up with their systems in terms of what they were going to do to manage, the colonies themselves. What is the bureaucracy going to be like? Who's going to be in charge of what? What are we going to require people to do? How are we going to defend ourselves? What is the collective? Right. And so all of these different things, really reflect the regions in which they're in, which is the reason why you have very different forms of government that exist, whether it's more of like a courtly form in South Carolina and Virginia, whereas it's going to be more of like a council form in Massachusetts. And so this self-governance is really a test. It is that aspect of putting into practice those ideas of individuality within a collective that's a part of a larger whole, but is largely left to its own to be able to figure out how to manage. And so when you look at those forms of governance, take a look at the different types of colonies that exist. You have a couple of forms. One is known as a proprietary colony, which is basically these are land grants that were given to the king. And Maryland, where we are now, is one example. So, you had King Charles I gives Lord Calvert, this land grant and basically is allowed to establish and develop the land for however, he sees fit. Then you have other aspects in terms of like these colonies. I don't know why I clicked so quickly. Um, in terms of, how exactly they manage their day-to-day operations. But even if the king grants various lands, you still have to be able to maintain and figure out how you're going to govern with the king's authority. You still have to deal with the day to day here, right? So whether that's guarding yourself against Native American incursion, other European incursions, the issues in terms of disease or starvation, right? All of these different aspects you have to be able to figure out. And all of those processes of survival really creates this sense of individuality, that it's really up to me. It's up to us to be able to figure out how we're going to do this. No one's coming to save us. No one's going to figure this out for us. We have to do it ourselves. Okay. And some of the first examples of where exactly this sort of early forms of governance and enforcing and responding to various issues can be seen in the Salem witch trials. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of how exactly this happened, but you can go ahead and read over it and every of all the stuff that actually happened in terms of creating this hysteria that happens in this event. And go ahead and click on the links because there's actually some great primary sources that can actually demonstrate to you what was actually happening in this period in the 1690s. But the main aspect is this, is that what you actually have from this is from this experience of where, several people, well over almost 30 people are hung and tried as witches, the hysteria that, that's created, the distrust that happens between neighbors, right? All of this, there is an impact that comes out. And one of the things that happens is that various new institutional processes in terms of laws result. So one of these is going to be the ability to have a lawyer, right? Somebody to defend you, somebody to speak on your behalf, somebody to help represent you, right? We call that counsel, right? And that is something that will make its way into or eventually into our Constitution, right? We have new evidence standards that are required. We have this presumption of innocence, right? We also have this idea that that you're going to have certain rights that you're entitled to. And all of this in the 1690s, as it comes out of this experience of, enormous tragedy, is really the consequence of what is going on in terms of the Enlightenment thinkers, right? These are these first ideas that are coming out in the 1690s that are, asking and begging the question, well, what exactly does it mean to be able to have certain rights, certain opportunities, certain privileges? And so what we see in like the Salem witch trials is a very good example of how the Enlightenment influences outcomes. We have a crisis, we have various responses, we realize that this is not exactly the best way to do it. How can we have done this better, right? That sort of deep self-reflection, that interpersonal introspection, right? All of these ideas, and this is eventually what takes shape. Now, it is important to understand that, in addition to the conflicts that may be happening between neighbor and neighbor or colony and colony, there's also things happening in terms of the conflicts that are happening amongst other colonial powers, so namely France and Spain. And so it should be understood that in the early 1700s, there was several different conflicts that took place, and the colonists have to respond. They have to figure out how to defend themselves against other European enemies, against Native Americans, right? There's all of this sense of having to figure out how to manage and survive. And one of the things that comes out of this is the Albany Congress, which was a meeting of the colonial representatives, all of the colonies along the eastern seaboard, to actually try to figure out how they can create a unified strategy to address all the conflicts that were happening with Native Americans as well as other Europeans, right? Let's try to figure this out together. There is a unified experience in terms of being under attack or being under threat, and so they come together as a group. That early formation of coming together to try to figure out a solution is one of the early forms of government, right? Where is that being influenced? Well, certainly from the Enlightenment, because this idea of good governance, this idea that, one can be able to create a self-developing as well as managing approach to be able to maintain some sort of sustainment. Right? This isn't just a sense of like, well, we just need to protect ourselves. Well, we actually have the right and the duty to, because this is what's necessary for us to be able to survive. And so when you look at things like the Albany Plan, right? You look at things like an alliance, you look at unified colonial defense, and you look at intercolonial cooperation. This is what's going to lay the foundation for eventual colonial unification, right? And the idea of states that are united and that eventually become one country, right? But it's in this early period, influence from various Enlightenment aspects that create this notion that something is possible. Because remember, this is 1754. We're deep already into the deep Enlightenment period, right? And European ideas are flowing, right? Remember, there's a constant stream of information that's coming back and forth. People are reading, people are interacting with various ideas. And so this is the reason why we get this notion. And so if you want to click on this, especially when looking at the work of Benjamin Franklin, and you can see how the plan really started to come together with this idea that the colonies could have a government, an idea for a central government that could create, rules and standards for trade, for dealing with the Native Americans, et cetera, and even be able to levy taxes. Now, of course, this thing didn't fly, but it certainly demonstrated that there was a possibility that this actually could happen. Because here we are in 1754, 20 years later, we're already going to be in the throes of revolution, and we will eventually, in 23 years later, we will have our, beginning of our republic, right? Because we'll be in the throes of the Revolutionary War, and eventually come up with our own, we have already got our Declaration of Principles, but then we will eventually have our Constitution. Okay, so let's get to the one of the main characteristics that creates the sense of independency, which is the French and Indian War. Okay. Now, the French and Indian War, based on the borders of what we would consider, or was considered back then, the frontier, is that you had Native American incursions and French incursions and expansionism in the areas of what we would call Pennsylvania and New York today. And so with the British seeing an opportunity in which to not only protect their current sphere of influence, but possibly also expand it, engage in a series of skirmishes that extend between 1754 and 1763, collectively what we call the French and Indian Wars. Without going into detail with all the wars, what you need to understand is what actually helps, what actually is the consequences of it. The war was essentially won because of the efforts of the colonies. And that is because, not just because of the men that they provide in terms of fighting in the actual conflict, but the knowledge that these colonists had in terms of the region, as well as the ways in which they could fight. What is the consequence of that is that the colonists come out of this war realizing that without them, England would have never had a chance at all, and that they actually had the ability in which to beat larger, more prepared, as well as what you would say is like well-equipped allies, namely the French and their Native American allies. So the colonists come out of this with a good sense of, we've got this, we've got this confidence, we've got a sense that we can defend ourselves against stronger individuals. And this gives them a sense of, possibility that, well, if we can do it to them, maybe we could do it to somebody else. It also creates a sense of unity, right? That the colonists begin to see themselves as a colonial group, not necessarily Americans, but definitely a group that is distinct from Europeans, right? And so this is something that, although they were protected under British law, they began to see themselves not entirely as British. And because they are beginning to see these differences amongst themselves, there is also a greater sense of awareness that, what, well, maybe all those years of being under, of being able to figure it out on our own, whether it is laws, economy, survival, Native Americans, European incursion, maybe we have or are something distinct and not exactly the same as our cousins across the ocean. And so this is what eventually leads to the First Continental Congress to appeal some of the issues that come as a result of the French and Indian War. Mainly this. The French and Indian War was a lot of money. It nearly bankrupted the British coffers. And so the best way to get that money back is to raise taxes. Well, let's raise taxes on the people who have, the most to give. And that seems to be the colonists. And so these taxes start getting raised in various ways, whether it's going to be on trade, whether it's on stamps, whether it's on paper or molasses or sugar or tea, right? There's all of these sort of aspects in terms of these grievances. And what happens is the colonists start to get together because, once again, you have the British government imposing taxes. You have a group that is being required to pay these taxes. This further creates a sense of unification because we're all under this requirement to pay something that we do not feel is just. So here it starts to create this collective identity. And so what happens is by 1775, things are just, all out rebellion, right? You have Paul Revere riding, and then you have the Battle of Bunker Hill. You have various battles that are going all over the place in 1775. And so what happens is essentially, the war is beginning, which is usually attributed to with Lexington and Concord. But what I really want you to understand is that it's not just it's not just the war that creates a sense of identity, right? That is distinct. Because remember, they are reading these works by these Enlightenment thinkers in the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s. Okay. They are reading books in terms of the despots of kings. They are reading texts about this idea of independent self-governments, that government should rule for the good of the people, that government should be able to create, spaces in which all people feel, a part of the system, right? And so with the imposing of taxes, with skirmishes, with the fighting for rights, with this idea of liberty, right? You have this culminating effect in terms of this sense of identity that is calling for a greater sense of freedom, right? And this is the reason why we have this eventual resolution, what will be later turned into the Declaration of Independence, right? That you have a call for something to be done to redress our grievances. But in order for us to do so, we must first recognize that we are something distinct. And this idea of a distinction is found so much in the Declaration of Independence. Okay. If you click on these links here, one of the fascinating things is that you can actually see within the document itself the essence of Enlightenment thinkers, right? When you look at stuff like this, we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? Where does that come from? Well, that's Rousseau. That's natural law, right? This idea that there are certain truths that exist in nature. And we believe that what we are experiencing, that all men are created equal, right? And that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That is very much imbued from Rousseau, Montesquieu, as well as from John Locke. These ideas that Jefferson is writing in this work, because although, yes, you can take a look. Yes, there are 5 people that are a part of this committee, but it is Jefferson here in the middle who is essentially the one who is writing this work. And you had maybe Ben Franklin certainly was, put some editing skills in there, and then John Adams to defend it, in front of the Congress. This document here, is fascinating because when he lists the grievances, right? He has refused his assent to the laws and the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He's refused to pass laws in the accommodation of large districts of people. He's endeavored to prevent the population of these states and obstructing the laws of naturalization for foreigners. He's dissolved the representative houses repeatedly, right? He is listing out every single aspect of how King George III has been derelict in his duties of being a divine and just king, a just leader, right? And therefore, by the laws of nature and man, he is no longer worthy to sit into this position. Where exactly does this idea come from? Because remember, 200 years ago, if we were to roll this back to 1575, this notion was absolutely unheard of. You can't object against the king. It goes from God to the Pope to the king to you. But here, they're like, absolutely not. Kings don't just rule by divine right. They rule and they have to do what is right by the people. that they rule by the consent of the governed, that they rule in terms of making life better for their people, not worse, right? And these are all of the Enlightenment thinkers that are coming in here, right? That is richly, deeply rich, with John Locke and Montesquieu, who strongly influenced um, Jefferson in terms of this. I mean, it's just pouring from his, quill here, if you as you read this, and what's fascinating is that you could see right here, even the areas that are crossed out, there's fascinating stuff to look in terms of crossed out, like what was left, what is left out. This part here, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life, liberty, and the persons of a distant people who never offended him. Now, of course, this didn't make it into the copy, right? So, what's fascinating is that even when you read the original draft, you can hear how the Enlightenment thinkers have influenced Jefferson. But like all thinkers, he's taken those ideas and he's gone a little bit further, right? In the development, in making these aspects, this call for independence to be something that is truly innate, that all people want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They want that freedom to choose for themselves, a government that is for themselves. I mean, John Adams, when trying to get the colonies to unify and declare for independence, he made it clear. He was like, what they're doing at the Declaration of Independence is that he said to all of them, he was like, we're in the midst of revolution, right? The most unique, unlike any kind, because we are saying to ourselves that we can create a government for ourselves and for our children and our children's children. How many people on this planet have ever been able to do that? Right? He's like, this is total. And so this is what is so incredible about this, is that how they are asserting their independence, their identity, their distinct nature, right, is imbued in all of these documents. And it's absolutely fascinating to look at that, right? So, take a look at the justifications and the revolution and the principles. And, as you're breaking down the document, you can even listen to it here. Some great stuff. It'll play it there. And there's the actual document itself. You can see it in Washington, D.C. if you ever just want to take a tootle on down, take the train and see it there. But clearly, as you can see here, what were the ideas that influenced Jefferson? And this is all from the Enlightenment. You see the Second Treatise of Government, that's from John Locke. You see, the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, right? The English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta definitely earlier than the Enlightenment as well as the Reformation. But the English Declaration of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, excuse me, this is one of the first forms that really established those individual rights and how government could be limited. And so this is very crucial for you to recognize, is that, when he is borrowing from John Locke and when he's influenced by the ideas of Montesquieu and Rousseau, right? Jefferson is taking a look at these aspects and he is amalgamating them to what is the American experience, right? Is he's applying these ideas to something that is unique to this, moment. But as we shall see, one that inspires and influences others. Okay. And because we will see that this impact the Declaration of Independence is going to have impacts on other countries, namely France in 1789, but as well as all the other countries and, states that will try to declare independence going forward. So when you take a look at all of that, consider where exactly these ideas come from. The American Revolution is once again another iteration of the very principles that started with Luther, right? We have this idea and this notion that comes up that you don't necessarily need an entity to help determine your future. You can choose this for yourself. You can have a relationship with God. You can create it. And if it's put on you to make the decisions, then we see that iteration again in the 1600s under the colonies, right? That they had to figure out how to survive, how to plant, how to manage, how to govern, how to, make this work. And do they make mistakes? Certainly. You can see that in the Salem witch trials. But all of this moves forward as they begin to create an identity and demonstrate through their behaviors and through their experiences that they are distinct, that they are different, and that they can be determiners of their own future. The Declaration of Independence, a document that is definitely rife with the Enlightenment thinkers of the period, certainly is that next iteration. And so as we look forward with other revolutions, namely the French Revolution in the next lecture, we shall see that too. Okay, so take a look.